Hello, 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 and welcome back to Jesus and Everything. Today we are doing a very special episode because it is my first top 5. In this particular episode, we are exploring the top 5 stories your Sunday school teacher probably never taught you. Yes, these are stories from the Bible that might be a bit of a surprise to many people, but they are stories that many times we do not necessarily hear in Sunday school classes or preached across the pulpit, but we still need to know within our biblical consciousness. So stay with us today, comment, subscribe, learn about the 5 stories you probably have never heard preached, probably never heard teach, probably never heard spoken that come right from the Bible. I do want to offer a content warning. In this particular episode, some of the stories are very graphic and deal with sexual violence. And so if for whatever reason you don't necessarily want to continue along, I totally understand. But just wanted to provide that for right up front. So if you're willing to stick around and listen to these particular stories, let's stay connected. I do also want to share that this particular top 5 is exploring the stories from the Old Testament. So this is thinking about some of the weirdest, strangest, problematic story that we found within the Old Testament that honestly, when we think about it, read it, deal with it, can still provide us life. So many of us are familiar with the story of Noah. Right? The story of the guy that God came to and said, hey, I am about to flood the world. There's a lot of wickedness. I am sick of it. Let's just flood the world and start over. Noah built a big boat and there was 2 kinds of animals of every kind brought into the boat. Very familiar Sunday school story. But I don't know how many of us have actually read the portion of the Bible right before we get to Noah. That particular portion is found in Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, verse 1. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. What in the world is a Nephilim? I promise you, I actually do not know. And I would actually argue that most people do not know. It's a really weird text. It says that in verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterwards when the sons of God went into the daughters of human. What? Like, who are these people? Who are these sons of God known as Nephilim? If you look at many other translations, many times people would translate Nephilim as these giants or these monsters or these like demigods, like these Hercules type figures, part God, part human. Like, what in the world are they? Many people honestly don't know. And because they don't know, they don't think it's necessary to teach this in Sunday school or to preach this in church. Personally, I don't necessarily think it's wrong to not know. I think it's a really fascinating story. It leads me to ask more questions, which quite honestly is an okay thing. I just really want to know, like, from anyone Googling from a good old-fashioned Sunday school teacher, what is the Nephilim? This is one of the stories that many people just do not talk about in Sunday school. I have never heard a sermon preached on it. And quite honestly, it's in the Bible. And if we think that the Bible is the inspired word of God, let's at least have some conversation about it. The second story that we're going to read is about a prophet named Elisha. And it's kind of a weird story. It's also a bit of a tragic story. And I'll just read the story and let you decide how weird and tragic you think it is. The story comes from 2 Kings, the 2nd chapter, verses 23 through 25. He went up from there to Bethel, referring to the prophet Elisha. And while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go away, bald head! Go away, bald head!" When he turned around and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 she-bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. From there he went on to Mount Carmel and then returned to Samaria. What in the absolute... Oh yeah, this is still Jesus and everything. What in the world? Okay. Did Elisha not ever hear the story of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me? Is Elisha upset that someone called him a bald-headed hood rat? A bald-headed scallywag? Like, is he really that fragile to where some little boys calling him bald-headed made him get so upset and mad that he cursed them to where 2 she-bears had to come and maul 42 of them? Like, can you imagine, like, 42 parents are out here upset that their sons got mauled just because they called some dude a bald-headed scallywag? Like, really, Elisha? Like, you that fragile? You more fragile than masculinity. So, masculinity has been fragile for a long time, y'all. It's even in the Bible. But as comical as I am making this story, this is actually kind of sad. Like 42 little boys died by 2 she-bears, and it says he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Like, God, what are you doing being involved in this pettiness? It's a story. It's a weird story. It's a tragic story. It can kind of even be a comical story because you realize that like the consequence clearly outweighed what actually happened. But it's a story that many of us will probably say we have never heard taught in Sunday school or even preached across the pulpit. Second story, 2 Kings, the 2nd chapter, 23 through 25 is in the Bible. Read it for yourself. The third story might also be unfamiliar to you. Now, many of us have heard the story of David and Goliath. David is the small little boy who takes a slingshot of stones and pebbles and slings it and kills the big, tall, 9-foot giant Goliath. Many of us are familiar with that story. David's a very popular known figure within the Old Testament scriptures. There is a particular story about David that many of us might not necessarily be familiar with. It's found in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Let's see what the story says. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 20. Now Saul's daughter, Saul is the king at the time. Saul's daughter Michal loved David. Saul was told, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. Saul commands his servants, speak to David in private and say, see, the king is delighted with you, and all of his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants reported these words to David in private. And David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man and of no repute? The servants of Saul told him, this is what David said. Then Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no marriage present except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged on the king's enemies. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When his servants told David these things, David was well pleased to be the king's son-in-law before the time had expired. David rose and went along with his men and killed 100 of the Philistines, and David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number, to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Saul gave him his daughter Michal as a wife. What? So, okay. Let me just recap this story real quick. Saul's daughter Michal wants to marry David. Saul's like, okay, cool. But Saul is secretly trying to kill David as well. Y'all didn't hear that in the story, but just a little additional background. Saul really doesn't like David because Saul is afraid that David is going to become the new king and take over Saul's kingdom. And Saul isn't necessarily ready to give up being king just yet. So what he does is he sets up a plot to try to actually get David killed. He says, you know what? You can marry my daughter if you slaughter these Philistines and bring me back their foreskins. For those who might not be familiar with what foreskins is the head of the penis. It's the part of the penis that is removed in circumcision. So Saul tells David, in an effort to get David to be killed, to go and kill all these Philistines and bring me back their foreskins. Saul is actually thinking that David is going to fail. But David is actually successful and brings back, according to the text, 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Can you imagine that? Killing all these people, all to just marry a woman, and then after you kill them, you circumcise them, put their foreskins to a bag or a box or whatever they was carrying this stuff in, brings it to the king, and the king is like, oh yeah, this is the acceptable present that I need in exchange for my daughter to become your wife. Look, I know folks are into some very kinky things, and I do not kink shame, but my goodness, this is a weird story, and it's really tragic because like 100 men had to die to satisfy this weird exchange of a present for a bride. It's in the story. It's a story. It's in the book. It's in the Bible. 1 Samuel 18. Read it for yourself. You probably ain't heard it in Sunday school. You probably ain't heard it preached across a sermon, but you did hear it on Jesus and Everything. I do want to offer a content warning for this fourth particular passage. You might not have heard it preached across the pulpit. You might not have heard it taught in a Sunday school class because it's actually a really challenging text. Many of us are familiar with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. I mentioned it in my episode on Jesus and Sodom and Gomorrah. But many of us might not be familiar with what happens after Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed. So fast forward a little bit. Lot leaves with his wife and his 2 daughters. Lot is the gentleman that the 2 angels visit when they come to visit Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot is the one that gets to be saved from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and his family, particularly his wife and his 2 daughters, flee and run for the hills. Many of us are familiar with the story of how Lot's wife turns to look back on the city and turns into a pillar of salt. But that's where many of our memories about this story ends. If we continue to read the story, we actually see that it takes a very tragic, weird, and strange turn. Let's see what the story actually says. The story is coming from Genesis, the 19th chapter, verses 30 through 38. And it reads, Now Lot went up out of Zoar and settled in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the world. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that he may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she rose. On the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, Look, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, so that we may preserve offspring through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger rose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Thus, both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son named Moab. He is the ancestor of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and named him Ben-Ami. He is the ancestor of the Ammonites to this day. The story is not necessarily a flattering story. It's really a heartbreaking story. Here we find a father and his two daughters. His two daughters come up with this plan to give the father wine so that he is incapacitated and does not know that his body is then used as a form of procreation without his consent. I understand the desire to not want to talk about this text because it is an uncomfortable text. But I think this text opens up the door for us to have conversations that many of us neglect to talk about. To talk about the fact that men can be victims of sexual violence. To talk about the fact that alcohol is the leading drug used to facilitate sexual violence. To talk about incest. To talk about the fact that many children are oftentimes sexually violated by a family member. There is so much within this text that I know breaks our hearts, but also opens up doors for us to really deal with complicated, problematic, heartbreaking discussions that many of us do not want to have, but need to have because it affects too many within our community. For our fifth and final story that you might not have heard preached across the pulpit or taught in Sunday school, I also want to offer a content warning. This story is very graphic and also very challenging, and so I definitely want to make space for if it can be a bit much. It does talk about sexual violence as well as domestic violence. In this particular story, we find a Levite who is traveling. And this particular Levite is traveling to reconnect with his concubine. He got into a fight with his concubine. His concubine left and went home with her father. The concubine, the Levite, they wind up meeting up and they wind up making up. And now the concubine is traveling back home with her husband or with the Levite. As they're traveling back home, they find themselves in a bit of an altercation. So let's see what it says within the text. So the Levite has met up with this guy that is going to, provide some hospitality and going to provide an opportunity for the Levite and the concubine to spend the night as they're traveling back home. Hear what the text says. The text is coming from Judges chapter 19, verse 22. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a perverse lot, surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man," referring to the Levite, "who came into your house so that we may have intercourse with him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly, since this man is my guest. Do not do this vile thing. Here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out. Here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Ravish them and do whatever you want to do to them. But against this man, do no such vile thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and put her out to them. They wantonly raped her and abused her all throughout the night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. As morning appeared, the woman fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. In the morning, her master got up, opened the doors of the house, and when he went out to go on his way, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her, "we are going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man set out from his home. When he had entered his house, he took a knife, and grasping his concubine, he cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. So after reading this, let us just take a deep breath. Such a complicated text. There's so much here. There's domestic violence because this particular concubine lives within the home of this Levite. There is sexual violence. This concubine is discarded and thought to be worthless and offered up and is wantonly raped. There is just the absolute objectification of this woman to where she is no longer considered a human in this text. She is considered a sexual object to ward off some type of violence against the Levite. Then there is physical violence to where she is then murdered by the Levite and chopped into 12 pieces. So much violence is found in this text. So much heartbreak and trauma and disaster is found in this text that I want to know is in the Bible. It is a heartbreaking text. But in conclusion, with this story and all the stories from today's video, these particular stories are not outside the scope of the world in which we live in. This particular story in Judges 19 hits on topics similar to story number 4 that we need to talk about. It hits on domestic violence. It hits on the objectification of women. It hits on domestic abuse. It hits on sexual assault. And it hits on murder and rape. Topics that we in the church can no longer ignore. Topics that we in the church have to be willing to confront and to face. We, for far too long, thought that if we ignored the issue, that the issue will go away. The only thing that has gone away are the solutions. The only thing that has gone away is the healing. The only thing that has gone away is the restoration people need. And it's only going to happen when we are willing to confront difficult texts and we are willing to confront difficult realities that people face every day. The text might not be beautiful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that beauty cannot be found. Beauty can be found when we as a community are willing to read these texts, think about these texts, and be inspired from these texts to change the world so that the world of these texts no longer remain the world that we live in. So that the world that we do live in is the world God promised us. When we say that prayer, we are establishing God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. If there was a particular story today that you weren't aware of, please like, comment, and subscribe. Comment down below. What story did you find to be most fascinating? What story did you think really just shocked you? What story did you just not know was actually in the scripture? I want to know. Let's engage in community. Let's do the work that I am encouraging us all to do. Talk about those difficult topics. Let's do what I'm encouraging us all to do. Talk about those difficult topics so that we can experience a solved future and experience the solutions of God. I want to share with you a few national resources if you know of someone who has dealt with or is dealing with any of the subject matter discussed within our video today. There's the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which is found at 800-799-7233. There's the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. There's the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. They can be located at 800-656-HOPE. And then there's the National Sexual Assault and Harassment Legal Hotline. They can be found at 567-782-8837. Thank you.